As Paul said, my name's Russell Kempley, and I'm at BAE Detica. And I lead the cyber respond team for Detica, and amongst many other things, we provide instant response services to companies and other organisations that have become victim to targeted cyber attacks. So, let's make sure this works. As I said, today I'm going to talk about command and control, which is a pretty common feature of this kind of targeted attack. It's one of many stages in the life cycle, along with other things such as reconnaissance and infiltration, and together they make up what's sometimes referred to as the kill chain. So I appreciate some, if not many people here are going to be familiar with the concepts of command and control, but I'll start by talking about the context of that and why it's commonly used and the various different ways in which it can work. I'll talk also about how it's evolved in the years that we've been working and studying these attacks, and look at some of the changes that the attackers have made to respond to the changing environment in which they're operating from a security perspective. Also probably talk a little bit about how we're going to think it will evolve going forward as well, and what kind of things we need to be preparing for, both as instant responders and as penetration testers. Talk a little bit about how we can discover target attacks by looking for evidence of the behaviours of command and control. So lots of focus tends to be around discovering attacks based upon the infiltration methods that are used, but actually command and control also gives us the ability to discover attacks in the later stages of the life cycle. And through analysis of the attacks, we'll also see how we can provide some useful understanding for the victims to understand why they've been attacked and what they can do to prevent or at least limit the damage from further intrusions in the future. And then finally we'll have a few conclusions and general lessons at the end. But as we go through, I'll try and sort of pull out the key lessons as we see them for instant responders and for penetration testers, as I said. Okay, so let's get underway. So I'll try and keep this fairly light, given it's the start of the day. So here is a very simple illustration to show the concept of command and control. So we're talking about or understand each other's kind of nomenclature, because sometimes there's a few differences in how these are described. So we have in this very simple scenario an attacker who is somewhere in the network, and it's either an individual or it's a group of people, but it's very much a kind of thinking entity that can actually focus and target their activities upon a particular victim or organisation. We also have the victim shown here, and these are linked through some malware which sits on the victim's computer, talking over some infrastructure that the attacker controls to create a communications channel for passing the command and control messages backwards and forwards. So that's all very straightforward. Let's have a look at what that actually means. So, as I started to say, command and control is quite an essential feature of target attacks. It's very unusual in our experience for the attacker to know precisely what it is they're going to do on a target network when they first go onto it. So command and control allows them the flexibility to communicate with the malware that they've inserted or somehow got onto the network through other means in order to move around the network, to look at what resources are there, and to focus on particular information or individuals or industrial processes that they happen to be particularly interested in. This contrasts with non-target attacks, where there are simply too many infected machines for any kind of one group or any one person to really be investigating or using each machine kind of for some sort of intelligence value. You do still get some similarities in terms of how, say, a large botnet is controlled. There may be command and control to do bulk updates of configuration, but it's not the kind of interactive and targeted command and control that we see in the kind of state-sponsored attacks. So because command and control is essential to target attacks, it's actually a very good way to to understand them, to discover them, and to understand the similarities and differences between the various different groups that are acting in this space. The similarities arise because actually, at a conceptual level at least, there are relatively few different architectures for command and control. So it might be that the malware that's been inserted into the network makes a regular request to ask if there is a new command message, or the attacker may have some way to push in messages, but from a kind of conceptual architectural level, there are actually not many different ways of doing it, although as we'll see, there are various different ways of communicating it. And that gives us some ability to discover behaviours at a quite general and high level. As I was saying, command and control, in order for it to be effective, needs some means to pass backwards and forwards across the infrastructure. That means a communications channel, and any time that the malware communicates across the network, it gives us opportunities to find it if we know where to look. And as we'll see in a moment, the evolution of command and control has been more about the evolution of communications and how to hide the messages more and more discreetly in legitimate traffic than it has necessarily been about actual evolution of the command and control functions themselves. Okay, so I'm going to make a few kind of broad sweeping assumptions in what I'm about to say, so feel free to pick holes later. But let's, for the sake of argument, say that in the very earliest days, most targeted attacks would have been effectively inbound in nature. And what I mean by that is that the attacker would be outside the network and they would use either a poorly secured service such as Telnet, which had maybe not locked down properly with user accounts, or some other service which was exploitable and allowed them to reach into the network directly from the outside, and maybe there's no DMZ, so they're not kind of restricted from progressing on through the network. In these situations, command and control is pretty straightforward, because if you have managed to get access to a Telnet server or some kind of remote access server, then you can just use legitimate methods. But these, as people became kind of aware of the threat of attacks, and through the kind of greater understanding of the risks through penetration testing services and so on and so forth, more and more of these services have been locked down, properly secured, using authentication, and although in many cases it's still possible to achieve an inbound attack if you happen to have the right kind of zero-day, it's much easier from the attacker's perspective to do an inside-out attack, so to get some malware into the network via, say, spear phishing. And once you've done that, you'll have a much wider aperture to communicate your messages. And so in the early days of this style of attack, we saw what I would call custom protocols. So this might be because in the early days, firewalls may have allowed out a variety of different ports and protocols. The attackers didn't have to try too hard to find one that would work. So IRC was used quite a lot, but there are other bespoke protocols that got used as well. And again, eventually we found that, or the attackers found that the kinds of protocols that were allowed out would get locked down, and so they tended to migrate to use or leverage other protocols that, or more typical protocols such as HTTP, quite a popular one, because pretty much it's allowed out of all networks, and it's very flexible in terms of the kind of payloads that it can take. So I think we've got a quick example of an early HTTP payload. So I think this is no, it's not the only hex you'll see this morning, but there's not too much of it. So this is a very simple HTTP header, and then the attacker has basically just put some ASCII representation of the messages into the bottom of that, but it's clearly, to our eyes, not valid HTML. It doesn't look like it's likely to be any other kind of expected data types to be transferred over HTTP. But to early firewalls and proxies, they didn't really care, and so this was quite successful. But again, there were improvements in the types of activity that firewalls and intrusion detection systems could find, and so the attackers evolved again. The next kind of big class of command and control channels was hiding the messages in web pages. So now you do have legitimate HTML. If you visit the page as an investigator, you will see that it looks moderately legitimate. It's got pictures and words and so on and so forth, and so potentially you don't focus too much on that in the investigation, but actually somewhere within the code of that page, hidden in HTML comments, for example, would be some kind of message that the attacker was posting for the malware to see. And one of the particular large state-sponsored groups became so well known for using this technique that they're now largely referred to as the comment crew, but they use other techniques, and there are other groups who've done similar things as well. Now, this also became possible for intrusion detection systems to find, so again, there's been an evolution. And rather than hiding just in the HTML pages, where comments which contain non-human readable words can be picked out by heuristic algorithms, the attackers then made a move to hide in web objects, so I mean images or JavaScript or movies or any kind of binary component that is valid over HTTP. If you can fix into that binary stream some bits or bytes that contain a message that's encoded, then it's very easy to get them and interpret them from the malware's perspective, but from the point of view of an IDS, it's quite hard to differentiate that from potentially legitimate content. A couple of examples of this. So, ironically enough, this image, which contains a command and control message, is from a site selling fishing equipment. But within the code for that image, which we're seeing here, at the, I'm not going to explain JPEG, but there's some structure to that message that allows the attacker to put in a fake footer, and within the footer, which is the last few highlighted bytes here, we can, if we know the algorithm, which we can extract from the malware, we can see that actually decodes to a command message from the attacker. So this one, net view / domain, not very exciting, but actually from the attacker's point of view, it's still very useful. It's giving them reconnaissance on the target system. It allows them to see a list of servers in the network that they've compromised. And so that was one of the early commands that we often see them using. Okay, so alongside the evolution that we've seen in command and control messages, in as much as becoming more and more stealthy in how they're hidden in pages, the other thing that, from the attacker's perspective, has led to them being found is the fact that they tend to use quite obscure sites, or they have tended to use quite obscure sites. So if they register their own domain, or if they compromise a third-party site, but it's not a very popular third-party site, maybe it sells fishing equipment, so it's a small company and hasn't been able to afford securing their web servers very much, it means that traffic to and from that site is pretty rare on the networks, and certainly traffic to that site, which is only loading JPEG, stands out quite a lot to an analyst. So the other thing that we've seen in the last couple of years is an increasing trend amongst attack groups to use legitimate websites, large legitimate websites, as means of conveying the command and control messages. So, example of that this is a page on blog.com. So there can be quite a lot of traffic to and from this on a regular basis. This particular blog is posting not very readable messages, but if you're a computer, that message is actually a URL, and the instruction here is to for the malware that's reading this blog page, if you like, reading this blog page, the instruction is to go and visit that next site and to get further commands from there. Now, this obviously, as an investigator, if you visit it, does stand out quite a lot, and so in the same way that we saw increasingly stealthy techniques being used in more traditional command and control channels, now that they've switched to legitimate sites, actually the same things are all possible. So again, lots of irony used on the part of the attackers here to hide some command and control messages in a picture about hidden hazards. But within this picture, using open source tool steghide, so actually this is now not just packed in at the back in a fake footer. This is now hidden in the graphic itself. Is actually a long list of commands that are being sent to the malware. Now, as it happens, this one, TDL4, isn't actually a targeted attack, so I've slightly exceeded my brief to use as an example. But this is, as I was suggesting at the beginning, this is an example of command and control being used to reprogram a large botnet. So this configuration file contains a variety of different instructions about changing the infrastructure and so on that were used. But the techniques here of using a popular site and then using steganography to hide messages on that site is something that we expect. The one thing that remains a weakness from the attacker's perspective here is that if you are using popular sites, it's quite easy for us to browse them and to look at these messages. So once we've found the blogs, and once we know how the messages are hidden, we can then look across a range of different blog sites to find out information about what the attacker has been up to. Here's a graph that shows how the various different blogs related to TDL4 were updated at various points last year. So we can see that the attacker has moved the infrastructure. So there's been, at the start of the year, they had the 4 sites top left, 5 sites top left, and by the end of the year, they had the 3 bottom right. And at various points, they've reconfigured that architecture as they've gone through. And we can see all that because it's all posted on a public site. So in terms of where we think it's going to go next, and there's already some evidence to say it's gone there, the one extra functionality that the malware really needs is the ability to restrict access to these posts so that they can only be seen by its own malware. And conveniently, there are sites which allow you to have privacy settings so that you can lock down access to your command and control channel so that only people you want to be able to see it are able to do so. And these sites also have the benefit of being available over SSLs, so you also get the benefit of over-the-wire encryption too. There's a couple of examples on here. The Twitter feed is, I think, is actually a real example of command and control over Twitter. The one on the left is something that we've created for some of the penetration testing that Detica does in order to demonstrate the risks around having access out to sites like Facebook and not having the kind of monitoring in place that can differentiate a valid use of Facebook from one that's more like this. Right, that's quite a long diversion. Back on the theme of evolution. Actually, that's more or less all that I wanted to say on the kind of command and control channels that we see on a reasonably regular basis. There are a few specialist protocols, and I mentioned I was making some assumptions and abbreviations in getting this talk into the time available. So it's worth pointing out, though, there are three other protocols worthy of note. DNS has actually been around for quite a while. It's quite possible to move quite a large amount of data arbitrarily across a DNS infrastructure. There are open source tools that allow you to proxy TCP traffic over DNS. We've seen that being used in targeted attacks to make, for example, remote desktop sessions available by using an open source TCP relay over DNS. We've also looked at extended Mapi protocol. This is the protocol which Outlook uses to talk to the Exchange server in a corporate environment. As you'll know, when you start Outlook, you don't actually need to authenticate to create that connection. It takes the authentication from you already being logged onto the domain. So if there's a piece of malware, you can run code that makes use of that authentication mechanism built into Windows. You can actually send and receive emails through Exchange on behalf of the user in a way that the user can't see. And we've created demonstration code for that, again, as part of the penetration testing work that we do. Final thing to mention, which is an enormous topic and worthy of a talk itself, and I think somebody later this afternoon may be talking about it, but industrial protocols and attacks on industrial infrastructure are clearly something that people are increasingly concerned about, and many of the industrial protocols are very poor from a security perspective, certainly some of the legacy ones, and there are a variety of ways in which you can perform command and control over some of those. If, for example, in an industrial context, HTTP happens to be not available to you. All right, so I'm going to talk for a few minutes about how we can use all that information about command and control channels to actually help us find them. I'm afraid this is a slightly marketing view of the system that we've got, but we have essentially a private cluster that we run in Detica, and we feed into that logs that we take from the various customers that we provide services to, and then on that cluster, we're able to run analytics, behavioural analytics, that can look for the kind of generic activities of command and control without having to rely kind of specifically on signatures for any particular piece of the infrastructure or malware component. And then having performed the analytics, those are all then presented to our SOC, where we can put in front of the analysts data that allows them to kind of quickly reject false positives and to work out which of the alerts the system is telling them actually needs or warrants further investigation and potentially support from the incident response team. So I've got a few examples of analytics that we've run on that system. First is quite a straightforward one. It's often known as beaconing, talked about quite a lot. Let's have a look at what that means in practice. That's not very exciting, is it? So what that means in practice is the malware, when it's installed onto the machine, in this kind of inside to outside context, is has to poll the server, the infrastructure on which the command messages are posted, and most of the time the attacker doesn't want to use the resource, doesn't want to actually send any commands in, so the malware will beacon, send out a message, say, hey, what's the latest command, and they'll get no response. And the effect of doing that check, say every 5 minutes, is that you get from a network traffic perspective, you get this timeline view, and every dot on here is a different connection out to the infrastructure, and it starts and stops at the end and start of every day, because the malware is probably running on somebody's laptop, and the person who has that laptop will go home, and at those points the traffic goes away, but for the whole of the rest of the time they're in the office, you see this kind of regular pattern, and that's what's referred to as beaconing. And from an analytics point of view, that's very easy to spot because it's nice and regular and so on. Sadly, it's not quite that straightforward because it's very easy in advanced attacks for the attacker to randomize the times at which they're connecting, or to do it on a schedule, or to diversify the request across multiple different sites. So if you've got 10 different servers in your infrastructure and you randomize the request across them, it becomes quite hard to see. The other thing is that actually, although that looks like a quite distinctive pattern that might stand out as beaconing, there are lots of other legitimate traffic that also create patterns like this, software doing automatic updates, or media where it's downloading the next frame of the video repeatedly over a period of time, can look quite similar. All right, the other thing, or the next behavior we look for are those related to endpoints and addressing. This is behaviors such as a number of addresses changing simultaneously if the infrastructure gets updated, or it might be that the registration for domains that are being used all contain features that are similar, although otherwise ostensibly unrelated. There's a variety of things in that kind of vein that can be useful. Final analytic behavior that's actually one of the most interesting, to my mind, is understanding that command and control channels generally have a limited number of states in which they operate. This is best illustrated with an example. So the first state might be at the beginning of the day when the malware first executes, it performs a registration message. It does that one time, and after that it switches into this beaconing mode where it's checking for new commands. After that, the two kind of broad categories of command might be update or reconfigure yourself in some way, but don't take any other further action, or to undertake some activity, and those activities might be to execute a particular command. We saw the net view command being used earlier, to transfer some files, either to put further malware into the estate or to exfiltrate documents of interest. Or in some cases, that's all too difficult. The attacker may just use the command and control system to relay a remote desktop view, so that they can navigate and use Explorer in the same way that people inside the network can. And so because there's only a limited number of states, gives us an idea of what we can look for. We can build a model of this, and then we can go and look for that model in the data. So here's an example of a slightly more realistic beaconing and multi-state scenario. So top left here, we have the registration message. The malware then enters a period of beaconing, and then later on in that day, the attacker sent some actual messages in, which are shown up in red here, because they are HTTP posts, and they're coloured in post in red in this timeline view. And there are various ways we can observe those states. So in this example, the URLs change for the different types of mode of operation. That's reasonably common. But if you can't see the URLs, potentially because it's encrypted inside SSL, or because they've been obfuscated in some way and it's encoded, then you can still observe these states by looking at timing factors and size of different packets, and trying to look for those kind of evidences of this model, this stateful model that we've got. So once you've discovered your attack and you've discovered the command and control channel, there are a few more skills and techniques that we need to use to really get the most value out of that. So description unpacking is one. Clearly, these messages are not always sent so we need to be able to work out how to read them. We can do that by analysing the malware and extracting algorithms. Sometimes we can just do it by using a little bit of intuition to work out what the encoding schemes might be. Sometimes we can do it by just using off-the-shelf tools if something has been hidden using tools like steghide that we saw earlier. We have to be able to identify which tool it is, and then we can read the messages. Here's a tool that we've built for doing simple XOR keys. 64-bit key used in this case, and we can see messages here that were being sent and received over the command and control channel. Messages such as I think we've got some copying some scripts and some additional malware tools. We can see an administrator password being used, and we can see various other things that are going on in that. That information is all really valuable to a victim of an attack because, for two main reasons. It allows us to determine what it is that the attacker is actually interested in. So if you're a business that's got operations in 30 countries and you do projects on hundreds of different topics, knowing that the attackers are interested in this project in this country means that you can maybe do more to defend the network in that area without having to incur the expense of upgrading absolutely everything at the same time. The other thing is that obviously at some point we'd like to remediate this attack. If we can observe what the attacker is doing, we can see what commands they're using, what additional malware files they put into the network. We can have greater confidence in our ability to remediate the incident and to make sure we've cleaned up all the various different components and infected machines. There is clearly also a risk to this approach, which is that you may well be sitting there watching the command and control channel when all of the company's IPR is exfiltrated, and sometimes it doesn't go down too well, so you need to make sure that the company understands that the pros and cons of this approach. And there are some things you can do to limit that risk, such as using packet shaping or reducing the access that the machine that's infected has to the rest of the network, so the attacker is still communicating with it and making requests, but actually if they try and get to the main file server, they'll find that it's offline for some reason. I don't know about everyone else's companies, but that's not unusual where I work, so that probably wouldn't smell a rat immediately. If you can't read the channel directly, then the other thing you can do is to actually replay it live with the malware. So if you have the malware that you think is producing the command and control channel and you have the web pages that the attacker has published, you can put both of those into an environment and you can just observe what the malware is doing. So if there's a command which you send it and it makes it put a file on disk, you can guess it's a put file on disk command, and so on. So you can kind of build up this picture of what activity was going on. It's a little bit slower, and given the risks that I outlined previously, it's not the way that we necessarily prefer to do things, but it is certainly an option in some cases. And all of this, as I was saying, leads to being able to do intent analysis, to being able to say what it was that the attacker was interested in, and improving the ability to clean up the attack afterwards. Okay, here's an example of a longer piece of command and control traffic that we've taken from one case. It's redacted in a few places, clearly to protect the innocent. But what we can learn from this, for example, is that the attacker was installing additional malware to access domain controllers, I think, in this example. And then also, most interestingly, at the bottom row, which some of you in the front may not be able to read, but there is a command being used to collect up copies of documents and PDFs related to visitors that went to a particular summit that this organisation had arranged. And so we can see that quite clearly there that there's a potential personnel issues, and there are also the focus is on the particular summit or the engagement. Okay, so in terms of summary, we've talked about how command and control is an essential feature of targeted attacks. There were one or two caveats along the way, but I think that is still a good working assumption. It is possible in the future that automation will improve. We've already seen in cases very advanced malware such as Stuxnet, that there is more automation, there's more knowledge up front. But actually, even in those cases, that malware was probably preceded by something more interactive that allowed the attacker to gain knowledge about the plant that was being attacked. And so command and control, even in those cases, is an important part, even if it's a precursor activity rather than part of the attack that hits the headlines. We've also seen that the methods used in targeted attacks will evolve over time and will continue to do so, and will blend further into the noise, and will start to use very popular, very large sites that are also very secure, such as Facebook, where it's difficult for us to differentiate the command and control traffic from legitimate accesses, and then difficult to investigate as well because of the privacy settings that can be set. But there is also hope from using the state machine models and for some of the other things that I've talked about, that we will still be able to find command and control channels even in that context. And the final point, since I know many people here are going to be from the penetration testing background, is that it's almost an appeal, I suppose, to make sure that we're educating companies that they need to be considering the protections they have against traffic which is heading outbound from the network, as much as we do about how it will get in the first place. It's very difficult to defend against an ever-changing array of zero-day exploits that can attack any piece of software without any kind of ability to collect signatures or understand necessarily what you're looking for. Even heuristic methods can miss exploits if the heuristics are run in an environment which doesn't quite reflect the end user's machine. So if the end user has installed a piece of software you don't have in your heuristic environment that's checking software and emails as they come into the estate, that heuristic environment won't be able to see the exploit take effect because the piece of software that it's affected against isn't there. So I think it's pretty sure bet that infiltration will continue to be possible in a large number of cases. Spear phishing is very easy if you're a targeted attacker despite all the training and awareness that users have. If you receive an email from somebody you don't know which is convincing and addressed to you and talks about something you're interested in, most users will still open it. Sometimes they'll write back to the attacker and say, "Are you sure you're legit?" And the attacker will say yes, but they'll still open it. So because of that, the fact that the command and control channels are a little bit more stable in some senses in the way that they operate and the models that we can use to find them, actually that for very advanced attacks, checking a resistance and the ability to detect malicious outbound communications is a very useful thing for a company to be able to do, and for penetration testers to point out and to say that you need to be doing more in this area.